Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webcast is on the curriculum on the June 1967 war. I'm Cheryl Fishbein. I'm the chair of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and my friend, Professor Ken Stein, who is one of America's most distinguished analysts on the Middle East. And he's going to be presenting to us today. This webcast is part of an ongoing series of webcasts that the JCPA will be putting on to educate our network on issues of importance. And I encourage all of you to please continue to tune in to us because Ken is going to start us off with a bang, and we look forward to many, many more exciting webinars with you. I'd like to turn this over to Harold Goldberg, who is the co-chair of JCPA's Israel Task Force. Thank you. Harold, you're on.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. First, some housekeeping. If you're only on the phone, there are some handouts that if you don't have access to them now through the web, just send a note to Chaya and we will send them out to you. For the rest of you, you can download the handouts directly from the GoToWebinar control panel. Secondly, we will be answering questions, and please use the chat drop down or the question drop down on your screen, and we will try and answer as many questions after Ken has spoken. So I'm pleased to welcome you to the JCPA webinar featuring Ken Stein, President of the Center for Israel Education. As Cheryl said, I'm Harold Goldberg and co-chair of the JCPA Israel Two-State Task Force. And the main focus of our work this year has been around the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, which is quickly approaching. There'll be a test at the end to know if you know the date. As part of this process, we have been monitoring and collecting materials that have been created that can be useful resources for the community relations field. To this end, the Atlanta-based Center for Israel Education has produced an in-depth overview of the June 1967 war. It is accessible online as an ebook or can be obtained in print format. The objective of the book is to put the 1967 war in context. The book catapults the reader back in time to see, to feel, to observe, to understand how and why the June 1967 war unfolded and what has happened since. This is a book that can be used simply as a paperback of what happened, or it can be used as a platform for learning by Jewish and non-Jewish communities, congregations, Jewish organizations, summer camps, or local JCPAs, or our local JCPA's impact, the war's impact, and the unfinished outcomes. The book is titled The June 1967 War, How It Changed Jewish, Israeli, and Middle Eastern History. The contents lead the reader to focus on how the war changed Israeli and Jewish history and Israel's relationship with the diaspora and with its Arab neighbors. We think it's a very useful tool, and therefore we took the opportunity to organize this professional development webinar for you. The webinar will focus on how best to use the contents of the book in your local programming. Rabbi Doug Kahn, the JCPA Emeritus Executive Director in San Francisco, along with Rabbi Stanley Davids and Rabbi Orkant, have praised the book for its useful contents and provision of context. Their review of the books may be found on the CIE Center for Israel Education website, and through this, Ken is actually going to walk us through some of the parts of the website so that you can see how to use it. Leading us in the webinar today is Ken Stein. For 40 years, a professor and teacher of modern Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israel studies at Emory University. Ken is the president of the Center for Israel Education in Atlanta, where he and his staff have written curriculum and provided seminars, workshops, and webinars on learning, owning, and belonging to Israel's story, Zionism's story, how and why Jews took destiny in their own hands to shape their future. Ken is one of the foremost experts in the United States on Israeli history, its politics, and foreign policy. Before I turn it over to Ken, I would like to ask all of you to close everything else that's on your desktop and your computer if you're on the webinar. It'll make the experience much more positive. And I also want to point out that Ken has spent 40 years preparing for this moment. So we would ask that you give him 40 minutes focused attention on this very, very important topic. So let me turn it over to you, Professor Stein.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, the staff at JCPA. I wish in those 40 years I'd learned how to dunk a basketball, but something about German Jewish boys who grew up in New York City, or Long Island, actually. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm delighted to share our findings. I want to thank first and foremost our staff at the Center for Israel Education and at the Institute for the Study of Modern Israel for their diligence, hard work, and putting together what I think is a pretty useful tool when it comes to learning and studying an aspect of modern Israel. What I want to do today is I would like to spend some time going through key aspects of the paperback or the ebook. Both can be accessed at our website. And then go through some of the specifics. Some of you already have received a handout which will chart pretty much an outline of what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the context of the Six-Day War, why it was a transformative event. Talk about the geography and how that changed and how that geography from the war has had an impact upon Israel's relationship with the diaspora and American Jewish relationship with Israel, not to mention Middle Eastern Arab states and Palestinian relationship with the State of Israel. I'd like to talk a little bit about the concepts that were there prior to the 1967 war, concepts that spilled over and maybe caused the war, had an impact on it. What were the immediate events prior to the war, the immediate results of the war, and most fascinating, of course, is the unfinished results of the war. Were there lessons to be learned from the war? Well, we're still trying to figure that out. Our tendency is to take a look at events when they affect Israel or they affect us as American Jews in a narrow look at what it did for us or what it did for Israel. And sometimes we forget to take a look at the broader picture of what it did to others and what it might still be doing. And I'd like to touch upon that as well. The first point I want to make is the following, that events in history may be considered to be benchmarks. They may be considered to be turning points, or they may be considered to be transformative. A benchmark event would be the creation of Israel. A benchmark event might be the bombing of Pearl Harbor. A transformative event would be, let's say, the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914. I would say that the fall of the Shah in 1979-1980 was a transformative event. And likewise, I'm going to argue and make the point that the 1967 war was a transformative event. It was transformative because it has a legacy, it has results that were totally unanticipated, and those results still are not completely finished. We still don't know what the total outcome or the complete outcome of that 1967 war is or was. In the context of 1967, it's a convenient time for us to take a very quick peek back at the last 100 years. And this conveniently for those of us who care about these things, this is one of those years of the sevens. 1897 was the founding of the World Zionist Organization, Herzl's effort. 1917, the Balfour Declaration, we'll be celebrating 100 years of that later on this year. 1947 was the UN decision to partition Palestine. 1967 was the Six-Day War or the June War. The Arab world would prefer not to refer to it as the Six-Day War because it's considered to be a humiliation and embarrassing, so their reference is to the June War. Sadat's visit to Jerusalem was November 1977. And then 1987 was the first Palestinian uprising. All those are to be seen on the handout that's been distributed to you or that Chaya and others at JCPA will send to you. But the 67 war, it's 50 years, had an impact far beyond anyone's anticipation or expectations. The Israeli government and people in May, June 67 still lived under the shadow of 20 years earlier was the creation of the state. 25 years earlier was the Holocaust. Israelis weren't quite sure if they were going to make it through May and June into 1967. I have to say parenthetically, as a historian, one of the great difficulties for historians is to catapult people back in time, to put them back into those moments of tension, of anxiety, of apprehension. What was it like building trenches in the major urban areas of Israel, trenches that could have been used for defending the people or trenches that could have been used as mass cemeteries? That was all a reality in May of 1967. The Arab world, Arab states, up until 67, still had not come to grips with the state of Israel, with the Jewish state. They did not succeed in the 1947-49 war. They lost the war. They refused to accept Israel as a reality. They still refuse to accept Israel reality in the period of May and June of 1967, and after the war of June of 1967. They still walked away from the war, even though they had lost the war, and by anyone's estimation, a huge humiliation. They still refused to accept the fact that the Jews had a right to have a nation state of their own on their own sovereign territory. In fact, we know in the month or two after the war, they proceeded to argue that there should be no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with the state of Israel. The Palestinians, after 1948, no one paid very much attention to them. Nasser tried to organize Arab unity or Arab identity based on Egyptian leadership, and he wanted to use the Palestinian issue as a vehicle, as a glue to keep Arab states together and attached to his leadership. Was there any effort on the part of the Jordanians or the Syrians or the Iraqis to think about providing for the Palestinians a state at that time? No, it just wasn't there. It wasn't in the cards. Prior to the 1967 war, we have three major overlapping conflicts. We have the Arab-Israeli conflict. We have the inter-Arab conflict of Arab states not particularly liking Nasser's thumb and heel and how he tried to impose himself. And we have the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States. And they all were present in May of 1967 when President Nasser decided the time had come for him to take on the state of Israel. Why did he choose to do that, and why did he choose to do it then? We know from memoirs written by Arab notables and by military men, people who served in the Egyptian army, that the Egyptian army was just not prepared to go to war, that the Air Force wasn't prepared, they didn't have sufficient number of pilots, they didn't have sufficient number of training. But Nasser got caught up in his own rhetoric. He got caught up in the belief that he had to assist Syria. He had to help other Arabs. And other Arab states got caught up in Nasser's rhetoric and Nasser's emotion, and they joined with him in this effort to try and whittle Israel down to size, or as they would say at the last part of May of 1967, just to simply destroy the state. Nasser used his prerogative to ask the United Nations to have troops that were stationed in Sinai, to have those troops that were there, placed there after the 1956 war, to separate Egypt and Israeli troops. He asked them to leave, and they left precipitously. People have asked, why did the United Nations, an organization that was established to keep the peace, why did the United Nations Secretary General U Thant simply say yes, yes to Nasser, yes, these peacekeepers, these people who are sitting between Israel and Egypt and their militaries, yes, he'll just ask them to leave. He didn't delay, he just said yes. Some people have argued that U Thant's actions may have been one of the least intelligent moves undertaken by any Secretary General in the history of the United Nations. He knew that by taking out these mediators between Egyptian and Israeli troops in Sinai, he knew that Nasser was headed toward war. And then Nasser blockaded the Straits of Tiran. He blockaded Israel's access to Eilat. Now, why is this context important? The context is important because if all we learn about the Six-Day War is that Israel took the West Bank, it took Judea and Samaria, and if all we learn is from that it built settlements, and from that it built settlements and it created a controversy within Israel and it created the division within the State of Israel, if all we learn is should there or should there not be a two-state solution, if we don't learn the context of what Israelis went through then, of the context of the Arab states making a clear decision to go to war, can we put the onus of responsibility of the results of the war on Israel's shoulders? I want to make a statement about this war that I think, if we remember nothing else about this webinar, is the following. If President Nasser had not gone to war in 1967, if Iraqi and Jordanian and Syrian troops had not joined, and other Arab states as well, if the Arab states had not gone to war, these Arab states, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, would not have lost territory. Israel would not have gained territory. And if Nasser hadn't lost the territory, Sadat would not have wanted it back. Yes, I can argue, and yes, it can be argued, that Nasser's decision to go to war unfolded another war in '73 and unfolded a diplomacy that led to Israel's peace treaty with Egypt. You want to put responsibility at someone's shoulders for the Egyptian-Israeli treaty ultimately? It was Sadat's absolute need to get Sinai back. And he did not necessarily want a peace with Israel. He needed a peace with Israel. He needed a peace through the United States. He wanted Sinai back. And he was willing to sign a treaty. So in that sense, the '67 war is transformative because it is the event that triggers 10 years later Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, and 12 years later the Egyptian-Israeli treaty. That's why the '67 war is so transformative. If Israelis had any doubts about their right to exist as a nation state or the ability to fend off an existential threat, the '67 war pointed out to them that they could succeed, and they did. What we learn about the Six-Day War is we learn that the great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, who are in this Cold War, were more worried about themselves going into a confrontation over the issue of freedom of navigation through the Straits of Tiran and into Eilat. They were more worried about a conflict between themselves than they were worried about keeping a war from breaking out between Israel and Egypt, or Israel and the Arab states. In other words, the great powers proved inept, just like the UN. They proved unable to stop this war from unfolding. The USSR was quite clear. It wanted to protect and defend Nasser. The United States and Lyndon Johnson and Dean Rusk and Robert McNamara were a lot more reluctant to stand out front and say to the Israelis, under all circumstances, we'll be sure that we'll be behind you. There's no question about it that Lyndon Johnson made it clear to Abba Eban and to Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, that the United States was going to be there for Israel, but not with the drive and not with the verve and not with the emphasis that one could see that the Soviet Union gave to Syria or to Egypt. That's not decrying the United States. What it's merely saying is Lyndon Johnson was a lot more careful than one would have expected him to be. He actually told Eshkol, Lyndon Johnson, the man of the Congress, he actually told Eshkol in the 2 or 3 or 4 days before the war, I'm not certain I can put together an international flotilla to break the blockade of Eilat. Lyndon Johnson said, I have to consult with Congress. If Lyndon Johnson couldn't make Congress yield to his wish and whim, there was no other president of the United States who could possibly have done that. Lyndon Johnson was the man of the Congress. But that was the excuse he gave to Levi Eshkol. What did the war do for the geography? Well, obviously, it increased Israel's size 5 or 6-fold. Israel now came in control over the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, reunified Jerusalem, took Sinai, Gaza, right down to the Suez Canal, the Golan Heights. Sitting on top of the heights, Israelis were within artillery distance from Damascus. It changed the geography of the Middle East, and it changed the Arab-Israeli conflict, because the conflict no longer was a conflict whereby Israel faced Arab states and Arab unity. Israel now faced the territorial interest of individual Arab states who wanted their land back. Nasser lost it. Sadat wanted it back. King Hussein wanted the West Bank, and he was in conflict and confrontation and argument with the PLO right through 1988, until finally he said, okay, PLO, if you want the West Bank back, you're going to have to negotiate that for yourself. I'm getting out of this. I'm preserving the East Bank of the kingdom. And we do have a Jordanian-Israeli treaty in 1994, and of course we have the Oslo Accords of 1993. Not only geographically, but the concepts after the war that emerged were totally unexpected. Who would have expected that there would be an entire evolution of a process that would be called peace process? Totally unheard of on June 3rd, 1967. The American government for the next 50 years became the steward of of diplomacy for negotiating or seeking to negotiate Arab-Israeli agreements. Granted, the European Union tried to play a role, and the Quartet, and the United Nations, and there were Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions. But the truth of it was that the United States became the key engineer, mediator, nudge, handholder, financier of trying to reach Arab-Israeli understanding. And we did it. We did it through Nixon and Kissinger. We did it with Carter and Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli Treaty. The Americans put themselves to the task and they succeeded. But one has to be really careful about saying why America succeeded. We succeeded because we were determined. We were succeeded because we had very talented people who were diplomats and State Department officials. We put a lot of time and effort into it. But it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for two people. If it hadn't been for Sadat and it hadn't been for Begin. Now, Begin and Sadat emerged out of the 1967 war as two individuals who realized that for the good of their respective countries, they had to reach an agreement between them because it was in the respective national interests of both countries. Another key element, outcome, that made the 67 war transformative was that the 67 war changed the nature of internal Israeli politics. It saw the emergence, ultimately, of the radical right in Israel and the Zionist right. And they're merging together 10 years after 1967 to see the election of Menachem Begin and see the election after 29 years in Israel of a party that was not the Labor Party. I'm not certain American Jews to this day have gotten used to the fact that there is a right of center government, or many American Jews, or a lot, or whatever the number is. I haven't done survey research on it. But over the last 50 years, 30 of those 50 years, Israel has been governed by someone of the center and center right, not someone of the center and center left. And the 67 war helped change that, because Israelis now took a look at themselves and said, manifest destiny, we're now in control of not only the land that we succeeded in winning in 1947, 48, and 49, but now we're in control of all the land west of the Jordan River. And there emerged from this the sense of manifest destiny, a sense of the land of Israel, and it became to be articulated in an ideology. And that ideology emerged very slowly into what we now know as terming the West Bank Judea and Samaria, and it emerged very slowly into what we now know as settlements. And it emerged real slowly, very slowly. I mean, the number of settlements that were in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Sinai, and in Golan Heights, during the Carter administration, the number of settlers was 20,000 or 25,000. The Carter administration that took a really negative attitude toward Begin and toward settlements never raised their hand and said, you got to stop settlements. And when he said it, he didn't put any teeth behind it. And as a consequence from the 80s forward, with Begin and Shamir and others, the Israeli government moved forward to take control of these territories, not just have physical control, but actually populate the area. What if the Arab states had come to Israel immediately after the 1967 war? What if they had said, let's negotiate. You withdraw from the territories you took in 67, and we'll recognize you. Never been a settlements issue. People have argued that the Israelis didn't do their task. They didn't reach out. Well, we do know that within 2 or 3 weeks after the war, in 1967, and this is pointed out in our unit, that the Israeli government reached out to Syria and reached out to Egypt and said, you know, we're ready. Now, there's some who argue that that message was not fully delivered or it wasn't fully understood. But what we do know from the Arab side of the agenda, that in August of 1967, these Arab states said no peace, no recognition of the state of Israel. My point is, if someone had put some limits or had set some restrictions on the Israelis within the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months or the 2 or 3 years after the 1967 war, if someone had stepped forward and said, yeah, we'll make peace with you, or reach an agreement with you, or a non-belligerency agreement with you. But instead, the Israelis were allowed to move forward almost at will. And it's significant to know that Lyndon Johnson, as President of the United States, no matter how slow he might have been in vocal or dramatic support of the state of Israel prior to the wars of June 4th, 1967, June 5th, Lyndon Johnson did something which no other president did. Lyndon Johnson said within a month after the war, if the Israelis withdraw from territories this time, Israelis are going to have to get something in return. And by that, Lyndon Johnson meant Israel's not withdrawing from Sinai like it did in 1957. And all it got was UN peacekeepers or observers. This time, Israel should be capable and willing to exchange this land for peace. And that's where we got this whole idea of land for peace. That came out of the 1967 war, came out of Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson said, you don't have to withdraw from this land until maybe you get something back in return. Now, he wasn't willing to defend Israel's total control and full control for the entire period of time while he was president through 1968. But he said, if there's going to be a negotiation, there has to be a result from it. And that was transformative. That was new. And out of Johnson's idea came in the next 6 months a UN resolution that came to be known as UN Resolution 242. That did not exist before the 1967 war. And that resolution became a framework, an outline for Arab-Israeli negotiations since. That's why the 67 war was transformative, because it set in motion processes, outlines, concepts that began to solidify Israel's international recognition. It had recognition already at the UN. It had recognition from many states around the world. But it didn't gain recognition from the Arab states until it got it after 1967 and after Sadat's visit to Jerusalem and after the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty of March 1979. Again, that's why I point out to you that it was transformative. Let me point out a couple of other items that are transformative before I step aside and ask if you have any questions. It was transformative in the sense that American Jews who had been supportive of Israel, but not overwhelmingly so, up to 67. The 67 war forced Americans, American Jews, and American Christians for that matter, feel impassioned by Israel's success in this war that took place in 6 days. American Jews now looked at Israel in a very different way. Israel became, if you don't mind me using the term, a religion or a part of a religion for American Jews. More trips to Israel, more Jews taking families to Israel, more people going on abroad programs to Israel. And later on in the 90s, with this upsurge in reality of Israel's part of Jewish identity, we have the whole brand new concept, which we hadn't thought of and looked at previously, known as birthright. Someone may say, I don't want to put birthright as a result of the 1967 war. But certainly the transformation that occurred to American Jews made American Jews feel a lot more embracive of the state of Israel. But at the same time, it pushed American Jews to a position that they had not yet even considered, that they might become critics of the state of Israel, and severe critics, and harsh critics, and angry critics of Israeli policies and policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians and toward the territories. That came about because of the 1967 war. A last point I want to make, and I think this is very important. The 6-Day War catalyzed, or I'll use the term formulated, a hardcore Palestinian national identity. Palestinians knew who they were before that, but after 67, and after they decided to adopt terrorism and violence as a mechanism to gain identity and gain recognition, there was a whole evolution of Palestinian historiography that heretofore had not even been considered by historians. And I would argue that those historians that wrote in the 1960s and the early 1970s, they were the precursor of the new historians who came along in 1987 to 89 that really questioned Israel's legitimacy. And did Israel really say it did what it did when it created the state in 1947 to 1949. What is fascinating to me as a historian is that the Six-Day War galvanized Palestinian identity, but it has, in the last 5 to 10 years, divided the Palestinians. Israel's reality has divided the Palestinians in a manner geographically and ideologically that they had never, ever endured in the period prior to the last 10 years. And while the United States has become the leading spokesman for Palestinian self-determination, maybe even more so than many Arab states, Palestinians themselves at this very moment are questioning, does anyone care about them? Should they be cared about, because they are so divided and so fragmented? The last time the Palestinians were fragmented and there was a fear of what would happen to them, Arafat joined the negotiating process in 1993. Now, that's not me sitting on front of a glass ball saying, be prepared for the Palestinians to accept some form of a negotiated settlement in the next 2 to 5 years. But a new term came about, the whole concept of a two-state solution. That was never even thought about in June of 1967. It wasn't thought about until, in a real essence, until the 90s. The term Palestinian self-determination was not a term that was used in public by the West or even by Arab states until the 1980s. That is all a result of the June 1967 war, and it is an unfinished result. We still don't know how that is going to unfold, and we don't understand how a two-state solution might unfold, if it will unfold. I'm going to ask Harold if he would do me a favor, please, and go to our website, and go to the Center for Israel Education website on the screen, www.israeled.org, and what you see is the website. It's www.israeled.org, and if we can flip back to it, Harold, see it again, please.
I am getting there.
Thank you. The website contains lots of information about all aspects of modern Israel. Particularly, the information is organized according to themes. And if we were at the top of the website, we would be seeing the themes. We'd see a drop-down menu, and the drop-down menu, there's a 1967 drop-down menu. And that drop-down menu, when you go to it, for those of you who are interested in pursuing some of the things I had to say further, what I suggest you do is I suggest you take a look at the landing page of the Six-Day War. Click on the themes at the top, would you, Harold, if you can? And the 67 War themes on the right-hand side, the menu, you'll see videos. You'll see suggested readings. You'll see a summary of the Six-Day War if you just want to play with the site. If you're interested in taking a look at the booklet that we produced, this is what it looks like. It's the June 1967 War, how it transformed, how it changed Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish history. It's about 112 pages long, and it works for anyone who's just interested in learning themselves, or if they want to spend some time teaching others. There are sample pages on the website so that you can see what the book looks like. and what the contents are. We know it's been used in synagogues. We know it's been used in for camp staffers in their preparation for going to camp this summer. We know it's been used in the classroom, and we know individuals have just taken it with them when they got on the plane at JFK and flew to Israel. They just sat there and read it from cover to cover. The reason it's interesting is because it contains a lot of data, a lot of historical context. There is, for example, a timeline that from the 1880s to the present. There are biographies of the individuals who were particularly participatory in the 1967 war. And when you click onto the themes on the left-hand side, right there, right, perfect, great, that's terrific. Now go to the right side, and you see, on the right side, you'll see videos. You'll see a bibliography just above the map. And there'll be plenty of things for you to read if you're really interested. If you want a deep dive, I can take you several miles down if you want a deep dive. If you're interested in the documents that relate to the war, there they are. Our interns, our staff, we typed them all up. They're all there, and you can see exactly what Nasser's resignation speech was. You can see exactly what Israel's offer was to the Syrians and to the Egyptians. You can take a look at UN Resolution 242. So if you're interested in just the general background, I suggest the book. If you're interested in the general background and deeper information, use the book and the website. And before I take questions, because I know we're going to the end, I have to make a request. One of the things we've done at the Center for Israel Education for 16 years, and this is separate from Emory, is we've tried to help teachers, day school and congregational teachers, learn more about Israel, to enrich their understanding about Israel. And we've been very fortunate by having the Avichai Foundation provide us with funds that enable us to have a teacher workshop that's run at the end of June of every year. And we have some slots left. We've had 2,200 teachers, 800 teachers taking the one-week workshop. And if you're representative of a day school or you're on a day school board, if you're interested in a congregational school and you want to move forward and learn more about Israel in general, not just about the Six-Day War from Abraham to Bibi, just go to the website and you can register, and I think you'll find it really fascinating. The goal of the Center for Israel Education is to have people have a passion and an understanding about the state of Israel and do it without polemics and do it without polarization. Harold, with your permission, I'd like to take any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Ken. We'll do a formal thank you in a moment, but we do have one question so far. So leaving aside the legality or illegitimacy of the settlements, would you reject the notion that the illegal occupation that resulted from the '67 war is in fact illegal?
Is the illegal occupation illegal? Is that what you said?
That's the question, yes.
Well, the war, the outcome of the war was that Israel ended up with the West Bank and with Golan Heights and East Jerusalem and Sinai. Was it illegal because Israel took the land in war? I think you can have international jurists who can argue that Israel had every right to defend itself. It has also been argued that Jordan was not the rightful inheritor of the land west of the Jordan River after 1948. In fact, it was supposed to be an Arab state established. So I'm not getting into the legalities or the illegalities. All I know is that Israel moved its sovereign prerogative to annex East Jerusalem at the end of June of 1967. And it passed the Jerusalem Law, one of its major laws, in July of 1980. which said that Jerusalem was the eternal capital of the state of Israel. Now, someone could argue that that's illegal, that the sovereign state doesn't have the right to make that judgment. In fact, Resolution 2334 of December of last year says that the territories taken in the 1967 war should be negotiated. Well, that includes East Jerusalem. Now you get into a question about what are the rights and prerogatives of a sovereign state versus the wishes and desire of the international community. And I leave that to people to debate themselves. I'm not going to come down one side or another on that.
Okay. Thank you, Ken. I want to remind everyone, if they'd like to ask questions, they can do it in the question box on their screen, or they can send a chat request to the panelists and organizers. I do have, while we're waiting for the next question, Ken, what you described is what I would call the butterfly effect, that the '67 war has had a number of unplanned or non-thought through consequences that we're living with to this day, and it's going to continue to have effects. I found the reading of the book Like Dreamers, where Yossi Klein Halevi really tries to show that effect in Israeli society in a really comprehensive way. Wondering if you could comment on that. It's like, is that book not so much accurate, because it took them 11 years to research, so I know it's accurate, but asking, I guess, for a little bit of a book review as it relates to the '67 war.
It's an excellent book. Yossi Klein Halevi is an excellent writer. It's an excellent book. I'd endorse anyone to read it, because what it does is it takes you down two parallel paths, and without making a necessary judgment about which one was right and which one was wrong. And it shows you how the Six-Day War changed internal Israeli politics, changed Israeli thinking, made Israelis either not care at all about the territories or care very much about them. And I don't take the view that the Six-Day War and its aftermath is having as the potential to destroy Israel is an existential threat to the state. An existential threat to the state would be Iran, right? And I think it's created huge controversy within Israel, probably more controversy outside of Israel, and particularly amongst American Jews, about what Israel should or should not be doing with the territories. And then the question always is, you can't negotiate with yourself. You have to have some address that's reputable and that's trustworthy, and that's not an excuse not to negotiate. I mean, you have to try all the time as best you can, because the goal of the state of Israel simply is this: to protect the security and territorial integrity of the state, and do whatever it takes to make that happen, but not to the point of putting yourself in a path that's going to ultimately cause a major problem for you in 5, 10, 15, and 25 years from now. I mean, you can nod your head and you're thinking the word demography, and as we all are. I got it. We all get it. It's very difficult in the middle of a process like we're in to really outline the outcome. Because we know, for many of us, we know what we'd like to see. We know where we'd like it to go. But it's not happening at the pace that many of us want, whether that's full annexation or it's a two-state solution.
Okay, great. We have another couple of questions. So one, you focused largely on the war with Egypt. Do the materials cover the conflict with Jordan, both before and during the war, including the Israeli intelligence assessment before the war that it would not be wise to occupy the West Bank, and the Israeli army raids in the West Bank shortly before the war? Yes,
it does. It deals with Samu. It deals with the effort made by the Israelis to reach out to the Jordanians. There are some really interesting videos of King Hussein after the war about his what he thought he was doing and what didn't happen. Yeah, we've also, it's been more difficult for us to get to the primary sources dealing with Syria. But it's been a little bit easier with Jordan because there were two really fine books that were written on Jordan in the 1967 war, which we were able to use in writing this.
Okay, great. I see that you have a 45-minute video, and I've become aware of the movie on the war made by the Christian Broadcasting Network. Any other recommendations for movie length or documentary treatments for the community viewing?
The two on the website, the best one is the one that's an hour and 53 minutes long. It's called June 67. I suggest you get a couple big bags of popcorn, sit down with your kids and your friends and your relatives and just watch it, because it's very fair. It shows you exactly what was going through Eshkol's mind, what was going through Nasser's mind, what was going through Hussein's mind. It's done with great rigor, and I strongly suggest it. There's another one, the second one just details how the Israelis did it militarily. In the booklet, in the book itself, when you get it electronically, there are several videos that deal with why the settlements are bad. There's also a video in there why the settlements have proven to be worthy for the state. So that when you get the ebook and you purchase the ebook, there are a lot more links that you can use than if you purchase the print version. I suggest the ebook because you can take it anywhere and you can use it anytime you want.
Okay. Question about the effect of the '67 war have on mass migration of the Jews from the Soviet Union.
Oh, what a great question. What a great question. I've had American Jews tell me just over the last 10 to 15 years, not going out looking for the answer. I've asked, when did you get involved in politics? Well, I got involved in politics in the Russian Jewry movement, or the free Russian Jewry movement. I said, why did you do that? He said, well, I was a 21-year-old after the 1967 war, and I went off to Israel, and later on in the early 1970s, I went off to Moscow. I went off to Leningrad, and before I went to Israel, and someone asked me to take a message to so-and-so, and what you find is, you find out that not only did American Jews feel like they should play a role in doing something for other Jews, but what you found is Russian Jews themselves felt, to a degree, and not as quickly as one had thought or might have wanted because of the fear on their part, they began to make noises. And when you ask a Jew who came from the former Soviet Union, they'll tell you that the '67 war had a very positive impact upon them. Someone should just sit down and ask Sharansky. I mean, I'm sure he's answered the question, but yeah, the Free Soviet Jewry movement. You have to be careful as a historian. How much do you want to lay at the feet of the '67 war? How transformative do you want it to say? Was it so transformative that it was responsible for the overthrow of the Shah? Well, if Israel took Jerusalem and Israel was now in control of the Muslim holy sites, what impact did that have on the Muslim world 12 and 13 years later? I don't know that. I can't answer that question. I don't have any survey research to show that. But I think you're right. I think whoever asked the question about the Free Soviet Jewry movement's got their finger on something. I'd also say American Jews and American Jewish involvement in politics, in American politics, really there was an upsurge after the 1967 war.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ken. We are coming up to our top of the hour, whatever time zone you're in. I want to thank Ken for a wonderful and stimulating and substantive presentation. We hope that you all found it to be productive and useful, and we would welcome your feedback. The books can be found in print and in ebook format, as Ken described, at the Center for Israel Education in their store. You can also hear more from Ken at our upcoming JCPA spring meetings, June 11th and 12th in New York, where we are having a special program to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. This program includes a symposium co-sponsored with the URJ, the AZRA, and the HUC, and it will include speakers, interactive sessions, and a concert. To learn more and register, please sign up on the JPA's website. I thank you all for joining today, and we look forward to doing more of these webcasts for the field in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, everyone, for listening.